in writing the biography of one of the most important and controversial figures of the 20th century. And we both thought the Bird Sherwin biography was excellent. It became our go-to source for many aspects of Oppenheimer's life. I should mention here that Marty Sherwin very generously let us read all his interviews that he had collected since the 1970s. They're now in the Library of Congress, but we got to read them in his dining room. Much better. As Shirley and I both agreed, the women in Oppenheimer's life remained in varying degrees in the shadow of his fame and accomplishments. By this time, Shirley had asked me if I would work with her on a biography of Kitty Oppenheimer. But serious problems developed quickly, not between Shirley and me, but between Shirley, me, and Kitty. There are almost no letters written by Kitty after 1939. If there are letters in the custody of their son, no one has been given access to them. So we then talked about writing a fictionalized account of Kitty's life. But Shirley was adamant that we should not, in her opinion. She decided we should write nonfiction, and since she was the novelist, that was the deciding factor, because I certainly couldn't write a novel. But the other problem was that most of the information that we had about Kitty was negative, even damning, and came from sources who were so biased against her as to be unreliable. Now I'm going to shift over to me. I brought a very different sort of experience to the writing of Atomic Love Story, and some of this Paul just kindly mentioned. Just as reading can be a path to self-discovery, so can writing, and it was for me. I had always known that I had lived at Walker Air Force Base in Roswell, New Mexico for several years as an older child, and that my father was a pilot and staff officer for the 509th Bomb Wing of the Strategic Air Command. I knew this from references I had overheard, but also because as a child and an older child, I would always see in the closet his flight suit with the 509th Bomb Wing, sewn onto the sleeve, and then he had the big leather, wonderful leather flight jacket with the 509th, right here. And he had an oxygen mask stuffed in the closet that also resembled an elephant's trunk. And periodically, a siren would sound, and all the men, or so it seemed, would run from wherever they were, the officers' club pool, the offices, their homes, to the flight line, where they would climb into their planes and await their orders. I had no idea then what those orders could have been, but eventually my father would always come back home, pack his gear in the closet, and life would go back to normal. I don't know when I heard the name Curtis LeMay, the Major General who commanded the 509th Bomb Wing, or heard that my father would be sent on TDYs to Kwajalein, which I guess is pronounced Kwajalein, but he always pronounced it Kwajalein. I grew up as a child of the post-atomic war, of the world, post-atomic world, atomic war and world. Oddly enough, although I'm a historian by profession, I never studied 20th century American history, but instead had chosen British history. And it was not until researching Atomic Love Story that the pieces of my personal puzzle began to come together, that the 509th Bomb Wing's predecessor was the 509th Composite Bomb Group, and that was the outfit that was assigned the responsibility for dropping atomic bombs, Oppenheimer's bomb, on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That General LeMay was the vocal proponent of the preemptive strategic nuclear bombing strategy and was a rabid opponent of Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer resisted the concept of hydrogen bombs and of preemptive bombing. He was not opposed to the atomic bomb per se. I also did know that the atoll of Kwajalein was the main base for the Anitawak and Bikini Island tests. But I never forgot what it was like to be on a high security base, to have to show my pass to the guard at the main gate whenever I left or came back to the base, and what it was like, the very type of woman that Kitty Oppenheimer chose not to befriend. Enough of us, and back to the writing of ALS. After deciding we couldn't focus on Kitty Oppenheimer alone, we simultaneously came up with the idea of writing about women in Oppenheimer's life. Although dozens of books have been written about him, as well as plays and television movies, and now a television series, but you can ask us questions about that later. And there's even an opera, Dr. Atomic. But very little has been published about the three women we thought central to his life. Jean Tatlock, his first real love, Kitty, his wife, and Ruth Tolman, who became his best true friend. Each of these women was smart, educated, and in her own way, fascinating. They were at the forefront of the generation of women born at the beginning of the 20th century, each of them moving into a man's world, each of them determined to make a difference. These were the women Robert Oppenheimer confided in, listened to, learned from, and shared many of the in-between hours when he was not absorbed in physics or government politics or lecturing. What we wrote is a love story, or rather 3 love stories, in which there is sex and romance, but we were looking for something deeper, more profound, the kind of relationship or love that develops with time and experience, which includes compassion as well as heartache. Now I'm going to introduce you to the women and their backgrounds as I share with you the photographs. This is just the easiest way for me to talk about them. Okay. Now I'm multitasking, so bear with me. Okay. This is obviously the cover of the book. The first photograph is Robert Oppenheimer with Ella, his mother, in 1906. Oppenheimer was born into an affluent German Jewish family. His father had come to work with his uncles in the garment trade. They were wealthy by 1906. They became even more so after World War I because Robert's father worked on linings for soldiers' overcoats. His mother was a beautiful, very reserved woman from a Baltimore Jewish family. Oh, okay, here we go. This is Robert and Rocks. Robert was a dreamy, precocious child with doting, protective parents. One of his close school friends from the Ethical Culture School described him later, saying that at 15, he was, quote, still a little boy. He was frail, very pink-cheeked, very shy, and very brilliant. He wasn't childish, really, just different. Paul, how do I get rid of next? Okay, I'm going to start talking while we try to get rid of next. This is a photograph of Kitty's German family. Their social class equivalent would have been, I think, what George Orwell described as lower upper middle class. Although for all of her life, Kitty would tell people that they were related to all the royalty of Europe. Franz Puning himself was a chemical engineer who designed blast furnaces, hence the move to Pittsburgh before World War I. His father was a professor. One of the most rewarding aspects of this book was tracking down some of the living relatives of the protagonists. We got to know the nephew of Jean Tatlock and the 2 great-nephews of Kitty, Martin Vissering, who lives in his family home in Bremen, and his brother Ulrich Vissering. They gave us interviews, family letters, and photographs that none of the biographers had seen before. This is one of the photographs that we're trying to rescue. But I can still point out, can you see, whoop, okay, come back. It'll come back, I have confidence. Okay. Okay. There we go. Okay, get me on the big screen, Paul, and then I'll move them along. You want to go up to, here we go. Okay, I'm going to start talking about them, and then they'll pop up again. The woman to the far left is a woman named Hildegard, who was Kitty's mother's younger sister. She would remain in touch with Kitty's mother, who sometimes wanted to be called Kate. She became a film director, and she worked with, here we go, the young girl. She worked with Klaus Liebenauer on the film J'accuse, which was a propaganda film sponsored by Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda, and it was supporting euthanasia. That was in 1941. Kate, Kitty's mother herself, is the older of the sisters. She was sometimes referred by Kitty and Kitty's friends as the dragon. And then there's another younger sister. She committed suicide during the war when her son was wounded or captured on the Eastern Front. The brother, the older brother, was Baudouin Vissering. Baudouin Vissering was a lieutenant general and first general staff officer in the Wehrmacht during the war. His son was a panzer commander on the Eastern Front. Then there's Kate herself. And, okay. Kate at one time was engaged to marry her first cousin once removed, whose name was Wilhelm Keitel. He became the supreme commander of the armed forces of the German army. And he wasn't like an Eisenhower or a Montgomery. He was actually in some ways almost a figurehead, although he had to echo the decisions made by Hitler. He, at the end of the war, was in constant contact with Hitler. He was hung at the end of the war after the Nuremberg trials for war crimes. I bring this up only because it shows you what an intensely German family Kitty had, and the conflict of when she was at Los Alamos, when she was the wife of the director, but her family was fighting on the other side. And during the researching of the book, we really didn't find any comments, and I ran across one later, which I'll share with you because it's a marvelous comment. Hans Bethe's wife, Rose, was asked by an interviewer if she remembered parties at the Oppenheimer house. She responded that she did remember them, but nothing was particularly tellable. The one conversation she remembered was Kitty, quote, somehow trying to tell me something about her German background. I don't really know what she was trying to tell me, except that it relates to Erwin Rommel, I think. She had uncles or something like that, and very high up military rank in Germany. I found it fascinating because clearly Kitty acknowledged her German connections and their position of power when she was at Los Alamos. Okay, I'm trying again. Okay, this is just a composite of family photographs that we got from Martin Vissering, and it's Kitty and her father. The one on the far right is Kitty and her parents when she came to America, when she was 2 years old. And the one below it is Kitty and her grandparents in Germany. This is Kitty as about a 16-year-old, an equestrian. Even though she partied a lot and was an equestrian, she was determined to get a PhD. Okay, Frank Ramsauer was Kitty's first love. She had left Pittsburgh after a year and a half to go study at Paris, supposedly studying at the Sorbonne, but mainly hanging out in the cafes. Frank, who was a Harvard-educated music major, was in Paris to study with Nadia Boulanger, and he would improvise jazz at nightclubs where Kitty met him and was smitten. They married in Christmas of 1932, and a year later, Kitty had the marriage annulled, claiming that she had found mirror writing that revealed that he was a drug addict and a homosexual, and that the proceedings of the annulment were so scandalous that they were closed. We then learned, a little bit like with the Visserings, Ulrich and Martin, we were able to track down, Shirley made the first steps, the daughters of Frank Ramsauer. He married after the annulment to a woman with whom he stayed married his entire life. He turned out to be the music department chairman at Wheaton College, Massachusetts, had a loving marriage, loving daughters, and was deeply respected by all his colleagues and friends. A very, very different picture that we were given by Kitty. He almost never spoke of Kitty, except for once to say that she had been pregnant and had had an abortion, and that he was saddened by the loss of his son. We were staggered when we heard this. I mean, it really sort of got us in the gut because it was such a different, we felt like we had restored this man's reputation, at least for us. Oh, this is another one of Frank. This is sort of about the time that he met Kitty and sort of his loose leather jacket, beret. And here's his family, the two daughters, Frank and his wife. Okay, this is Jean Tatlock, who was Robert's first love, the first woman in our book. Jean was beautiful, whimsical, generous, and tortured. She was 10 years younger than Robert, and her father was an eminent professor of English literature at UC Berkeley. Before that, he had been at Harvard and Stanford. She grew up in the world of Shakespeare and Dante and Donne. She was 22 when she met Robert and was about to begin Stanford Medical School. She would go on to become a doctor and a psychiatrist working with troubled children. Robert would write later that he met her at a time when he was vulnerable to falling in love, and described her as a lyrical, sensitive, yearning creature. He proposed to her twice. She refused him twice. Influenced by her sense of the great injustices in the world that she had developed as a teenager, and also influenced by her colleagues, she became a member of the Communist Party. She believed in it, but struggled with the conflict between communism and psychiatry. She was described as the one woman in the room you would always remember, and in retrospect, as Robert's great love. This is more of candid photographs of Jean. This is Kitty's passport photo. This was taken in 1936 when she had left her second husband, whom I'll get to go home and stay with her parents. Kitty's full name, after she married Robert, became Kitty Puning Ramsayer Dallet Harrison Oppenheimer. Robert was her fourth and last husband. She was his only wife. Through all their tribulations, they remained married for 37 years until Robert's death. As a young woman, she had been determined to get a PhD in botany, except that marriage and war kept interfering. The same quotes about her appear in the biographies. Robert's wife was bewitching, vivacious, a sexy dame, but not very nice. And sometimes, flat out, she was called a bitch. Robert, however, called her golden. Most men seemed to like her, women did not. Okay, this is Joe Dallet. This is Kitty's second husband. Joe was the real communist that she had met at a New Year's Eve party immediately after having gotten the annulment from her marriage with Frank Ramsayer. She never wasted any time moving from man to man. He had attended Dartmouth and was from a reasonably wealthy Jewish family on Long Island, but like many of his generation, he had been radicalized by the Sacco and Vanzetti trial and had become an ardent and strident communist. He was described as, quote, a gorgeous guy, a handsome son of a bitch. She moved in with him in a cramped shared apartment and tried to live the communist life, but ultimately failed and returned to her parents. Joe went on to Spain to fight in the Spanish Civil War. He was the reason she had joined the Communist Party, and this was a decision that would have repercussions for Oppenheimer later. This is the third of our women, Ruth Tolman. Ruth was the daughter of a Presbyterian minister and 10 years older than Robert. She was the wife of another very important physicist, Richard Tolman. Ruth studied philosophy at, quote, the university, as Berkeley was known then, and then went on to get a PhD in psychology there, studying with Richard's brother Edward, who was the head of the department. Edward Tolman is the Tolman of Tolman Hall there. This would be a pattern with Ruth. Charming, extremely intelligent, determined, and very hardworking, she also had important contacts throughout her life who helped her. She became a psychologist, working on criminal behavior at first, and then became one of the first clinical psychologists. During the war, she worked for a variety of government agencies, then for the last years for the OSS, training agents who were sent into the field. Ruth and Robert stayed in close touch all their lives. One of his secretaries said that he always had one of Ruth's letters in his pocket. Those who knew him most intimately called her Robert's best true friend. Okay, I may have missed one. I'm afraid to go back. Nope. Okay. The two photographs previous are Ruth and Richard together. This is a photograph of Richard Tolman, who was the dean of faculty at Caltech and one of Robert's closest friends. He was also responsible for introducing Robert to astrophysics. He became, during the war, General Grove's chief scientific advisor. He was also a member of the interim committee, which made the recommendations for the use of the bomb and where to drop the bomb. This is Robert. Robert ceased being a pink-cheeked, shy, frail young boy and became a very surprisingly hardy, robust man and loved horseback riding in the mountains of New Mexico. That's Kitty and their first son. I love this photo. This is Robert being a typical dad. He's supposed to be watching Peter, but he's reading something, and Peter's going to crawl away. Main gate at Los Alamos. This is Robert's badge. And so he would have been, 1942, he wasn't even 40 years old. No. He wasn't. So to give a sense of how young he was as the director of the lab. And this is a beautiful picture of Kitty. She had a great broad smile, people would say. And this is a very typical picture of Kitty. The physicist Ed Lofgren told Shirley that when he first was interviewed by Oppenheimer, Kitty was in the room, curled up on a sofa, smoking a cigarette. She liked to be around the men, especially the important men. But she, as I said before, had little time for women's activities. That's Robert and Kitty playing Tiddlywinks. This is Robert, Tony, and Kitty at Princeton. There's Ruth Tolman as an older woman. She's actually about 60-something there. This is the beach in St. John's where the Oppenheimer would go after 1954, and this was their escape. This is just a photo we loved of Tony playing with a blowfish. That's their daughter, who was born in Los Alamos. This is also a typical picture of Oppenheimer's life, partying on a boat. They loved boats. They both loved boats in the islands. Tony was also a horseback rider. And that's Peter, their son, who was actually rather a troubled youth. This is another typical picture of Kitty. She's alone. You notice she's got packs of cigarettes. She has a drink. She's reading, and there's no Robert around. This is explanatory. Robert receiving the Fermi Award, which was sort of his bringing him back into public recognition. This is just a fantastic picture of Robert. This picture shows what a handsome, charismatic man he could look like. He didn't take a lot of good pictures, but this one I think is very sexy. And the last picture here is Kitty sailing. Kitty and Robert were avid sailors, and it was where Kitty was most at ease, physically challenging the elements. Near the end of her life, when she was suffering from liver disease, she was told that she had to stop drinking and sailing. She responded that that would not be her life. She kept sailing and she kept drinking. She died in 1972 while sailing on the Panama coast.
Thank you. Let's see, is this good? Can you hear me? I'm going to do the reading from the book, 2 parts. When it was time to start writing this book, the first thing we had to do was decide on structure. We had 3 women and the 1 man they orbited. He was born in 1904. Jean Tatlock was 10 years younger, and Ruth Tolman 10 years older than Robert Oppenheimer. His wife Kitty was somewhere in the middle, older than Jean and younger than Ruth. So you see the challenge. When Jean was 10, Robert was 20, and Ruth was 30. We knew we would have to tackle our subjects chronologically, and we had literally stacks of timelines, which we used to keep track of who was doing what and when. The book starts with a section we call Bloodlines, which sketches in the heritage of each of the 4 principal characters from 1620 to 1920. Patricia did this absolutely wonderful, long list of what ship they came on and the dates and all the way back. We cut it back substantially. Actually, we made the decision to open the book even before that first chapter, detailing in a short 2 pages an episode that is initially outside of the timeline altogether. It takes place in a scant 24 hours, involves only one of the women in Robert Oppenheimer's life, the one who has been called his great love. 24 hours that would have repercussions for 10 long years and beyond. June 14, 1943. The light was fading by the time Robert Oppenheimer left LeConte Hall. He walked across campus at his usual fast clip, heading for the streetcar that would take him into San Francisco. He would have allowed his mind to skim over the consequences of what he was about to do. Not that he was weighing them. He had already made the decision to see Jean Tatlock. It would be more of an exercise to keep his mind occupied, to block the uncertainty of how he would find her, radiant or remorseful, perfect or flawed. There would be hell to pay, that he knew. He would have stopped to light a cigarette, maybe taking the opportunity to glance around for the Army security agent he knew would be there. He was too important to the war effort to be allowed to go loose in the world. His slender 6-foot frame and his signature pork pie hat made him an easy target. The security agents would inform Pash, and Pash would be delighted to inform General Groves, and the general would be livid. Oppenheimer was the new scientific director of the Los Alamos section of the Manhattan Project, hidden on a mesa high in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains of New Mexico. It was possible that seeing Jean could cause him to be removed from the project altogether. The idea was so disturbing that it would have had to be put out of his mind, along with his wife and the 2-year-old son he had left behind in Los Alamos. After one last deep drag of his cigarette, he would have flicked it away, then swung onto the key system train that would carry him over the Oakland Bay Bridge and into the city. He was 39 that June. Jean was 29. They had known each other, loved each other for 7 years. He would always want her. Twice he had come close to marrying her. 3 months before, when he had been about to leave Berkeley for Los Alamos, Jean had asked to see him, but he had not gone to her then. Too much was happening, too fast. He wasn't allowed to tell her why he was leaving or where he was going, could not confide what he and a remarkable band of scientists were attempting to create. Probably he was glad for that. Jean would not have approved. She was one of the most principled people he had ever known. She believed above all else in the sanctity of life. She was a physician now, a resident in psychiatry at Mount Zion Hospital, working with troubled children. She did not know that ending World War II might depend on the group's ability to develop a weapon of mass destruction so horrific it would defeat America's enemies, unless the Germans got it first. That grim possibility played on his mind. The Germans were intent on conquering all of Europe, the world. Would Jean, with her kind and open heart, be able to grasp the enormity of such a catastrophe? It was dark by the time the train rattled over the bridge. The FBI would have a file on Jean, on their relationship. What could they know about that relationship? All those years later, he would try to explain to strangers in a Washington, D.C. hearing room. We had been very much involved with one another, and there was still a very deep feeling when we saw each other. On that June evening in 1943, he knew that an agent would be lurking near her at the terminal in San Francisco, where she would be waiting for him. Oppenheimer arrived at 9:45 Pacific Western Time, the FBI report reads. He rushed to meet a young lady whom he kissed, and they walked away, arm in arm. They entered a 1935 green, Plymouth coupe, and the young lady drove. The car is registered to Jean Tatlock. She is 5'7", 128 pounds, long dark hair, slim, attractive. She was smiling, not hurting. He could see that. The Jean he could not give up. He would have smiled as she raised her face to kiss him, would have studied her with that intensity that so unsettled others, the blue eyes riveted, as if he could record the synapses of her brain. Others wilted under this attention. Jean did not. She slipped her arm into his and led him to the roadster. She drove east along the Embarcadero, the scene of so much of the labor unrest she had reported in the Western Worker, then turned west on Broadway. She had decided where they would eat, not one of the posh restaurants he would have chosen, but a shabby place not far from her apartment on Telegraph Hill. good for the spicy food he favored and some proletarian privacy. An agent waited outside. He would report. Drove to cafe, 787 Broadway at 10 p.m. Cheap type bar, cafe, and dance hall operated by Mexicans. Had few drinks, something to eat, went to 1405 Montgomery, where she lives on top floor. Appears to be very affectionate and intimate. At 11:30, lights went out. Within 2 weeks, Lieutenant Colonel Boris Pash, Chief of Counterintelligence for the 9th Army Corps in San Francisco, would send a memo to the Pentagon recommending that Dr. Oppenheimer be denied a security clearance and be fired as scientific director of the Manhattan Project, citing, among other things, this overnight tryst with Jean Tatlock, identified as his mistress and a known communist. Now, excuse me. The same episode is reprised twice within the body of the book. The second time, as it happened within the chronology, and then again some 10 years after the fact, in one of the temporary buildings on the Mall in Washington, D.C., left over from World War II. Here, a government panel convened what was called a security clearance hearing to decide if Robert Oppenheimer's top security clearance should be revoked, on the basis that the man known as the father of the atomic bomb could no longer be trusted with his country's secrets. The Rob who is asking the questions in this selection is Roger Robb, an assistant U.S. attorney who was hired to represent the panel. He had a reputation as a ruthless and skilled prosecutor who excelled in twisting witnesses' words. April 1954. With the benefit of time and distance, the Oppenheimer security clearance hearing seems more an inquisition than a review. Important voices declared it so even at the time. What made the hearing possible was the fear and the anti-communist fervor that engulfed the nation. Almost as soon as Robert entered the tawdry room in which his fate was to be decided, the man who could convince anybody of anything, who could captivate men and women alike, his language eloquent and precise, his voice pitch perfect, had vanished. When Robert left the leather sofa to take the witness chair, he suffered through 4 weeks of testimony from friends and critics and 6 days of direct question from the panel, interspersed with vicious courtroom hammering from Rob, who made Robert seem evasive and equivocal, and worse, embarrassed and humiliated. Robert would say he felt the way a soldier does in combat. So much is happening, or maybe about to happen, that there is no time to be aware of anything but the next move, like someone in a fight. And this was a fight. I had very little sense of self. As Robert suspected, Jean was a vulnerable spot. Rob began the grilling. Between 1939 and 1944, as I understand it, your acquaintance with Miss Tatlock was fairly casual. Is that right? Robert, our meetings were rare. I do not think it would be right to say that our acquaintance was casual. We had been very much involved with one another, and there was still a very deep feeling when we saw each other. Rob, what were the occasions for your seeing her? Robert, of course, sometimes we saw each other socially with other people. I remember visiting her around New Year's of 1941. Rob, where? Oppenheimer, I went to her home or to the hospital, I don't know which, and we went out for a drink at the top of the Mark. I remember that she came more than once to visit our home in Berkeley. Rob, you and Mrs. Oppenheimer? Robert, right. Her father lived around the corner from us. I visited her there once. I visited her, as I think I said earlier, in June or July of 1943. Rob, I believe you said in connection with that you had to see her. Robert, yes. Rob, why did you have to see her? Robert, she had indicated a great desire to see me before we left. At that time, I couldn't go. For one thing, I wasn't supposed to say where we were going or anything. I felt that she had to see me. She was undergoing psychiatric treatment. She was extremely unhappy. Rob was building to the moment when he would take Robert's confession. Did you find out why she had to see you? Robert, because she was still in love with me. Rob did not ask if Robert was still in love with her. He didn't need to, because the FBI files on their desk described the scene when Robert had met Jean that fateful day 10 years before. He rushed to meet a young lady, long dark hair, slim, attractive, whom he kissed and they walked away, arm in arm. Not unhappy, not that day. The questions flew back and forth. Where did you see her? At her home. Where was that? On Telegraph Hill. When did you see her after that? She took me to the airport, and I never saw her again. That was in 1943? Yes. Was she a communist at that time? We didn't talk about it. I doubt it. You have said in your answer that you knew she had been a communist? Yes, I knew that. Was there any reason for you to believe that she wasn't still a communist in 1943? No. Pardon? There wasn't, except that I have stated in general terms what I thought and think of her relations with the Communist Party. I do not know what she was doing in 1943. You have no reason to believe she wasn't a communist, do you? No. And then at last, you spent the night with her, didn't you? Yes. With that, Rob attacked. That is when you were working on a secret war project. Did you think that consistent with good security? Robert stumbled. It was, as a matter of fact, not a word. It was as if he wanted to stop himself, to say no more, not a word. He recovered and finished with a curt, it was not good practice. Rob paused. Didn't you think that put you in a rather difficult position had she been the kind of communist that you have described her? Robert wouldn't go that far. He answered, oh, but she wasn't. How did you know? I knew her. And that's one part of a book that includes many other relationships, but this with Jean Tadlock.